For homework assignment number 4, you are asked to do exercise 4.5 on page 90 and 91, problems 1 through 10. I asked you to not only identify the implicit premise, but to also diagram the argument. So beginning with number 1, sorry, it's not changing screens for some reason. All right, there we go. Sorry. Number 1, Tom is a very successful salesman, so he must be an outgoing person. And in this, you were asked to identify the implicit premise. Well, the first step is we'll go through and we'll just number the distinct propositions here. Number 1 is Tom is a very successful salesperson or salesman, so therefore he must be an outgoing person. And notice here that we have to connect. We have to bridge the gap from being a successful salesman to being an outgoing person. So we need some kind of premise that's going to do that. And it's going to be something like the following. Successful salesmen are outgoing people, or you might say very successful salesmen. That would be a little more precise. Now, as far as the numbering goes here, since this is such a simple argument, I just numbered this 1 and this 2, like we were doing at the very beginning, and then just use 3 for this down here. If we were to put this into premise conclusion form, and I know some of you did, you would number this as 1, this would be 3, and this would be 2. That way we could arrange them logically. But if you did it this way, that's also fine right now. If I ever ask you to put an argument into premise conclusion form, the numbering will matter in that because we'll want to arrange things from top to bottom, and at the bottom being the conclusion. Like the highest number will be the conclusion. But when we're just going through and just diagramming something like this, the numbers don't really matter so much. I mean, truthfully, I could have numbered this first proposition, Tom is a very successful salesman. I could have numbered that 49. I could have numbered this 56. I could have numbered that 27. The numbers at this point are irrelevant. What matters is when we turn to diagramming it, just that the diagram lines up correctly. So I'll maybe clarify that a little bit more, but this is how we would diagram this argument. We'd say 1 plus 3, and remember we use the lowercase a to indicate that this is an assumption, and then we do 2 down here because it's our conclusion. Like I said, I mean, we just, right now, since all we're focused on is just diagramming the argument, we're not actually putting this into premise conclusion form. The numbers don't really matter. Like I said, I could have said this is 43, 47, and 59, and as long as down here I put, oh God, I don't know if I remember, 43, 59A, and 47, I put that right here, the diagram would work out. So the numbers are just a way of symbolizing, they're just representations for these propositions. So if this is all confusing, I apologize, but basically, going back to the earlier point, I numbered this as 1, I numbered this as 2, and then this is 3. If your numbering is a little different than mine, like if you said this is 1, and then successful salesmen or outgoing people is 2, and then the conclusion you listed is 3, that's fine. What matters is just that you had 1 plus whatever you numbered the assumption as, if it was 2 or if it was 3, and then the A, and then the conclusion down here with the down arrow, and that you represent these as being dependent premises. Now, you might have worded this assumption slightly differently. You might have said, very successful salesmen or outgoing people, which is actually what I should have said to be precise, because it doesn't just say successful up here, it says very successful. You might have said all very successful salesmen are outgoing people, most very successful salesmen are outgoing people. Would you say only? I don't know if that would quite work. You'll only be a successful salesman if you're a very successful if you're an outgoing person. All of those are equivalent expressions. Or all of those are, I shouldn't say equivalent, but all of those are acceptable. So there's a wide range here. The point here, as long as you're connecting being a very successful salesman to being an outgoing person, such that being a very successful salesman requires, there has to be some kind of requirement of being outgoing. As long as you did that, that's an acceptable answer. Number 2, the doorbell just rang, someone must be at the door. So I'm just going to go through and number it like this. So the doorbell just rang, and the conclusion is someone must be at the door. A lot of different possibilities here, but this argument seems to be assuming something like when the doorbell rings, someone is usually at the door, or you might say whenever the doorbell rings, someone is at the door, or the doorbell only rings when someone is at the door. I mean, all of these would be acceptable bridges from 1 to 2. The basic idea here is you have to form a sentence that includes ringing of the doorbell and someone being at the door. And as long as you can put those two things into a single sentence, the doorbell ringing means someone's at the door. As long as you can include those, then you'll have the correct implicit assumption, or a reasonable one. And then we we diagram it just as follows. As a lot of you probably figured out, I think it's like 60% of these diagrams are going to be the exact same. They're going to be kind of boring, but there are a couple that are interesting, which is why I had you do this. So, cheating is dishonest and therefore wrong. And so our propositions here would be cheating is dishonest and it's implied cheating is wrong. I'm sorry, that might have been confusing. If you look at this sentence right here, let me go back a slide. It says cheating is dishonest and therefore wrong. You know, I said a long time ago that propositions have to have a subject and a verb and compose a complete thought. But if you look right here, it just says and therefore wrong. I mean, that's not a subject and a verb and composing complete thought. But when you have something like this occur in a sentence, it's implied that the cheating is part is kind of, you know, in parentheses over here. It's like assumed when this is being said, what the person is saying is cheating is dishonest and therefore cheating is wrong. So sorry, that's a little technical point. Don't worry about it too much if you got lost there. But so here is our argument. Cheating is dishonest, therefore cheating is wrong. Well, what is this argument is assuming? It has to connect dishonesty with wrongness in some way, and it's going to be something like this. Anything that is dishonest is wrong, or all dishonest acts are wrong, all dishonesty is wrong, something like that. You have to have some kind of statement that includes the words dishonesty and wrong in them in order to bridge the gulf from dishonest to wrong. And this one, like the other arguments we've seen, 1 plus 3a, don't forget your little lowercase a to indicate this is an assumption, and then the conclusion is 2. So I apologize that some of these are really uninteresting diagrams, but anyway. The same, there's a typo here, excuse me. Somehow this was a bad typo. This should read, this sample of copper melted at 1063 degrees Celsius in the laboratory, therefore all copper has a melting point of 1063 degrees Celsius. So, I'm sorry for that typo. How did I get the same? Anyway, so this sample of copper melted at this degree, therefore all copper has a melting point of this degree. And this one might not be obvious at first. You know, I had to think about it for a second. But basically, it's assuming that all copper has the same melting point. That all copper has the same melting point. So the diagram for this is the same as the previous ones. What you have to do is, like I said, when you're trying to identify the implicit premise, you're trying to get the concepts that are occurring here. So this sample, when it says the same, just think the sample, because I look like an idiot, typed the wrong thing. Melted at 1063 degrees Celsius in the laboratory. So you're trying to get from this sample to all copper. That's what you're trying to bridge. You're trying to bridge, you know, moving from this sample to all copper, and so you need something that's going to do that. So you know, it's like this piece of metal in front of me has a melting point of, you know, such and such degrees. Therefore, all copper has a melting point of this, you know, temperature. What do you have to assume? Well, this sample is like all samples, right? That all copper, and why would it be? Well, because all copper has the same melting point. So that's what you're trying to establish here. Politicians who are convicted of crime should not be returned to office, so Congressman Jones should not be reelected. We just number our propositions here. And I think this one's actually fairly straightforward, is that Congressman Jones, he got into some trouble. Congressman Jones was convicted of a crime. And again, you're moving from a statement about politicians to Congressman Jones in particular. You're moving from a statement about being convicted of a crime to not being reelected, and so you have to do something to bridge 1 to 2, and the obvious bridge, I think, is that Congressman Jones was convicted of a crime. This also, just like all the other ones, same exact diagram, nothing tricky there. The arresting officer had not read Johnson his Miranda rights, so the judge had to let him go, even though he confessed to the Pine Street burglary. All right. We just go through and we number this. So the arresting officer had not read Johnson his Miranda rights. The judge had to let him go. Number 3, he confessed to the Pine Street burglary. Well, what is this assuming here? Basically, anyone not read the Miranda rights must be let go, or anyone not read the Miranda rights cannot be convicted in a court of law. To be let go is just a colloquial way of expressing that you can't be convicted in a court of law. But something like this: everybody who's not read the Miranda rights must be let go. If you're not read your Miranda rights, you must be let go. These are all basically coming to the same point. So how would we diagram this one? Well, basically like this. If you didn't, and you notice here I omitted 3. He confessed to the Pine Street burglary. That is some unnecessary information. It really doesn't add to the gist of the argument here, to the essence of the core argument is he wasn't read his Miranda rights. Anyone not read the Miranda rights must be let go, so the judge had to let him go. That's it. To this argument here, it's really irrelevant that he confessed to the Pine Street burglary. That's an add-on. So you could delete that, and probably some of you may have not even separated out 2 and 3 as I did here, but I did just to emphasize this point, is that when we're distilling arguments, we want to focus only on what is absolutely essential, and we can cut out what is non-essential. So, in fact, you may, if you were distilling this, may not have even numbered this right here, and you would have just drawn a line through he confessed to the Pine Street burglary, because it really doesn't add to the core of the argument. Okay, the traditional wax record played on top-of-the-line equipment can reproduce the spatial features of music, such as the positions of the instruments in an orchestra. So in that respect, it is superior to most compact disc recordings. This one was actually a really interesting one, and I imagine some of you looked in the back of the book to get the answer. But let's first number the distinct propositions. And what is interesting to first point out about this is that there is a lot of unnecessary information in this one. And if we were distilling it, we would actually cross out played on top-of-the-line equipment. That is not essential to the argument. That is just a qualification on the first premise that really doesn't matter that much. And then the phrase, such as the positions of the instruments in an orchestra, that's just an example of what the first premise is saying. So if you were to say premise 1, all you would need to say is premise 1, the traditional wax record can reproduce spatial features of music. Boom, that's it. You don't need all that other stuff. And then it says, in that respect, again, that's just some qualification that's not really needed. All you need for the second proposition up here is, therefore, or so, it is superior to most compact disc recordings. So, if you're thinking about this argument, and it'd go like this: the traditional wax record can reproduce the spatial features of music, therefore, it is superior to most compact disc recordings. What is this assuming? Well, it's actually assuming a couple of different things. And one thing it's assuming is that compact discs can't reproduce spatial features of music. I mean, look at it. It is saying it is superior to most compact discs. Okay, well, what are you assuming about compact discs? Well, that they can't do this. It's also assuming that the music quality of a recording is better if it can reproduce spatial features of music. I think the book had something like, it is desirable to be able to reproduce spatial features. That's fine. I mean, I think three, as I've worded, three is pretty much obvious, but four, you could reword four in a couple of different ways. You might say, well, the music quality of a recording is superior, the music quality of a recording is better, it is more desirable. But the basic idea is that there's something positive about being able to reproduce spatial features of the music, all right? Or any recording. There's something positive about a recording's ability to be able to reproduce spatial features. And if you got something in that ballpark, you were right. And I think this is how you would diagram this argument. It would be that you have the traditional wax record can reproduce spatial features of a music, plus compact disc cannot do it, and then finally it is superior for a music recording to be able to do this. Therefore, the traditional wax record is superior to most compact disc recordings. So this is how you would diagram this argument. And like I said, this is an interesting one because it was actually more than one assumption going on here. Okay, number 8. The government should continue to deregulate the telecommunications industry because we need an industry that can act quickly and flexibly to exploit the new communications technologies. Well, here we can number our two propositions, and in this one, notice we have this indicator word right here, because. That means that what comes in two is the premise, and if this is the premise, this is the conclusion, that the government should continue to deregulate telecommunications industry. And there are different assumptions you might come up with here. This is what I thought it was, is that regulation prevents a company from acting quickly and flexibly to exploit the new communication technology. You might have worded it a little differently and said deregulation would allow. You know, I worded it negatively, but you might word it positively. And those propositions, I think, express the same thing. If I say regulation prevents a company from doing this, and if you said deregulation allows a company to do this, I mean, it's the same thing. But the basic idea is that you want to be able to connect this need to act quickly and flexibly to deregulation. You have to be able to connect those two concepts, and that's what this enables us to do. And here we have our argument. It would be 2 plus 3a, a to indicate assumption, leading down to 1. All right, now we come to number 9, which this was actually my favorite one out of all the homework assignment to do because it was just the most interesting. But the plays attributed to Shakespeare exhibit a profound intelligence, but Shakespeare himself never went to college and therefore could not have been very intelligent. So someone else wrote his plays. Well, let's number all these. And what is this argument assuming? And I think it's fairly clear that it's assuming something like one must attend college in order to be intelligent, or you don't want to say intelligent people attend college. That wouldn't actually be right, because this is saying that a requirement of being intelligent is that you've attended college. So you can't just say intelligent people attend college, because that would be consistent with intelligent people also not attending college. And this argument is assuming something different. It seems to be assuming that in order to be intelligent, you must attend a college. You must attend college. That is, if you are intelligent, then you have attended college. That could be another way of wording it. Now, how does the logic of this argument work? How do we diagram this? And this one's kind of interesting because it seems like what we're going to do is have something like the following. We're going to say Shakespeare never went to college himself. One must attend college in order to be intelligent. Therefore, 3, Shakespeare could not have been intelligent. The plays of Shakespeare display a profound intelligence, 3 plus 1. Therefore, someone else wrote his plays. So you notice here I have the down arrow from 2 to 5a going directly to 3. And then 3 and 1 combining to go to 4. And this is actually kind of an interesting example also, because you notice that how the argument as it's presented up here, it weaves back and forth with itself, and also it makes a certain assumption. And I have to say, this assumption down here, number 5, is false, obviously, and this argument doesn't work at all because it's based on a false assumption. But I think it's interesting how this argument works and kind of goes back and forth and doesn't go like a direct line like a lot of arguments. This is actually pretty typical of how arguments work in ordinary life, so that's why this is a very good example. And then finally, this one was kind of confusing because there's a lot of fancy language in it, but once you get past that, it's actually pretty easy. When testing the effects of a new drug, it's important to isolate the physical effects of the drug from the psychosomatic. That just means things are all in your head. From the psychosomatic effects of taking it. Therefore, one must use a placebo. And we number this right here, and we see that we have these two propositions. The conclusion is clearly number 2 because we have our indicator word, therefore, and it's assuming something like placebos isolate physical effects from psychosomatic effects. Basically what this is saying is a placebo enables you to determine what effects the drug is truly having versus ones that people are just imagining. Because people take drugs sometimes, like in a study, they'll take it and it's like, oh yeah, it's having this effect, but it's just all in their head. It's like, no, it's not having that effect. We gave you a sugar pill. So basically placebos enable scientists to distinguish true effects from fake effects. And the way we diagram this argument is just like the earlier ones. So 1 plus 3a down arrow 2. So hopefully this assignment wasn't too challenging for you. I think if you are getting something like identifying something like the assumptions that I was, if you were close to them, you're on the right track. If you're having a little bit of trouble with that, just 2 things I'll say. But the first is, remember, you have to look at your first your premise and then look at your conclusion and try to identify, well, what concepts in the premise are different from the concepts contained in the conclusion. And then basically what you want to do is write a statement that contains both of those distinct concepts. Whatever it is occurring in the premise that is different from here, write a statement that links them together, and that would be your assumption. And the second thing I'd say is, if you're having a little bit of trouble with this, send me an email, or even better, post your question on the discussion question or the questions about content on Blackboard, and other people can see it and benefit it, because if you're having a question, chances are other people are having that same question too.